The quiet beginning. The night was calm, yet inside both Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, storms of silence lived. People saw them as strong, admired, and always smiling. But behind that screen, pain had its place. Sandra had carried recent heartache that left her doubting her own strength. Keanu, though calm on the outside, held his own quiet scars. Neither spoke loudly about it. They respected the world too much to make their pain a headline. But life has its way of placing two souls together when they need each other most. The story began one evening when Sandra, tired from a long day, walked into a small coffee shop in Los Angeles. She wanted nothing but a moment of peace, maybe a cup of warm tea. Her mind was heavy with memories she tried to push away. Her heart still replayed the hurt she had lived through, and every smile felt like borrowed strength. As she stood in line, she heard a voice behind her. Soft, gentle, familiar. She turned, and there he was, Keanu, waiting in line like any ordinary man. He gave her that calm smile, the kind that said, "I see you," even when you don't say a word. "It's been a while," Keanu said quietly. Sandra nodded. "Too long," she replied, her voice almost breaking. They sat together not because they had planned to, but because the silence between them asked for company. The world often celebrated them for their movies, for their fame, but in that little corner of the shop, they were just two people searching for something real. Sandra wrapped her hands around the cup, not for the drink, but for the comfort of warmth. Keanu noticed the way her eyes drifted, the way her mind was far away. He didn't press her. He respected her silence because he understood it. Sometimes silence is not emptiness. Sometimes silence is where healing waits. The hook of this journey is not just about two stars sitting in a cafe. The hook lies in the unspoken truth. Two souls carrying invisible weight, finding themselves on a road that neither of them expected to walk together. Pain had broken them in different ways, but kindness, humility, and respect were about to rebuild something greater. As the evening stretched, Sandra finally spoke. "Do you ever feel like the world expects you to be strong every single day? And if you're not, you let everyone down?" Her words were fragile, like glass ready to crack. Keanu looked at her, his eyes holding quiet understanding. "Every day," he said. "But I learned something. Strength is not about pretending. Sometimes strength is just letting someone else sit with you while you're not okay." Her eyes watered. No one had said it that simply to her before. She realized in that moment why Keanu had always been different. He didn't try to fix her pain. He didn't throw quick answers. He simply made room for her to breathe. The next few minutes were filled with pauses, with long looks out the cafe window, with little pieces of memory surfacing. Sandra thought about her past heartache, about how much she gave, about how much she lost. Keanu thought of his own griefs, of the people he had loved and lost. Though their stories were different, the feelings felt familiar. Both knew the taste of loneliness, both knew the sharp edge of disappointment. Both knew how it felt to keep smiling when their heart wanted to stay hidden. A turning point came when a young boy entered the cafe with his mother. He carried a sketchbook filled with drawings of superheroes. Sandra smiled at the boy, and he shyly showed her one page. It was a drawing of two figures standing side by side, strong but with tears in their eyes. Sandra felt her chest tighten. She asked him softly, "Why are they crying?" The boy replied, "Because even heroes need to cry sometimes." Keanu looked at Sandra, and in that moment, no words were needed. The boy had spoken the truth they both carried. That night, when they left the cafe, something shifted. Sandra felt lighter, not because her pain had disappeared, but because it had been seen. Keanu walked beside her, not as a star, not as a co-actor, but as a friend who respected her broken pieces. And sometimes, that is the first step to healing. But this was only the beginning. What neither of them knew was that this quiet meeting would lead to moments of deep conflict, emotional trials, and surprising turns that would test their resilience and kindness in ways they had never faced before. And so, their secret healing journey began, one step at a time, in silence, in humility, in the raw truth of being human. The weight of silence. The days that followed were heavy but different. Sandra found herself thinking about that cafe moment again and again. There had been something unusual about it, something that lingered longer than a simple conversation. It wasn't the coffee, it wasn't the setting. It was the way Keanu's words stayed with her like an echo she couldn't ignore. Sometimes strength is just letting someone else sit with you while you're not okay. That sentence played in her heart every morning when she woke up. It was not advice. It was not a command. It was permission. Permission to be human, to breathe without always performing strength. Yet as much as she tried to carry that thought, the silence of her home felt like a reminder of how empty things had become. Here lies the hook. What happens when two people who know each other's faces, but not each other's wounds, suddenly begin walking toward those wounds together? What happens when silence becomes a bridge, not a wall? Sandra, for years, had been the bright face in interviews, the caring figure in films, the woman who gave laughter to millions. But the truth behind the camera was different. She carried scars from broken trust, from the nights when she cried alone, from the moments when her smile was a mask instead of a mirror of her heart. Keanu knew the same dance. He lived quietly, without much noise, without chasing attention. People often called him the kindest man in Hollywood, but very few understood that his kindness was not born from perfection. It was born from loss. He had lost people who meant the world to him, and every act of kindness was his way of keeping love alive in a world that had once taken so much. Two different wounds. 1. Same silence. A week after the cafe, Sandra received a message. It was from Keanu. Not long, not heavy. Just a simple line. There's a quiet bookstore near Westwood. Want to join me for a walk? She hesitated. A part of her wanted to hide, to keep her pain locked away. But another part, the part that remembered the boy in the cafe saying even heroes need to cry, whispered that maybe it was time to step outside her walls. She replied, yes. The bookstore was small, tucked between tall buildings, with a golden light spilling through its windows. When Sandra entered, the smell of old paper and dust wrapped around her like comfort. Keanu was already there, seated at a wooden table, flipping through a worn poetry book. Their conversation started slow, like soft rain. They spoke about books, about lines that stayed with them. Keanu read aloud a verse that said, "Grief is love with nowhere to go." Sandra felt her throat tighten. She whispered, "Then maybe healing is learning where to let that love go again." Hook after hook appeared in their dialogue. It wasn't about grand gestures. It was about words that peeled layers away, exposing truths no interview ever touched. Suddenly, a man in the bookstore began raising his voice at the cashier. He was frustrated, angry over a missing book order. The room grew tense. Sandra froze for a second, her heart racing from the sudden conflict. But Keanu stood slowly, walked to the man, and in the calmest voice said, "I know it feels unfair when something you expected doesn't arrive, but maybe what we find instead will be what we really needed." The man's anger softened. He looked down, embarrassed, and sat quietly again. The bookstore's air relaxed. Sandra watched this with wide eyes. It wasn't what Keanu said, it was how he said it. With respect, with humility, with no need to embarrass the man further. Sandra thought, this is why people call him different. As they left the store, she asked, "How do you do that? How do you stay so calm when someone is shouting?" Keanu smiled faintly. "Because I've been the one shouting too. I know what it feels like to be hurt and not know how to carry it. If someone had been patient with me then, maybe I would have learned earlier." Those words cut deep. Sandra realized she had been holding her hurt with anger at times, blaming herself, blaming others, letting bitterness grow inside. But Keanu's way was different. He carried his pain with quiet strength, not to impress, but to give others space to breathe. Later that night, Sandra sat alone in her room, but her silence was different now. It was no longer a prison. It was a space she could share. She wrote in her journal, "Maybe healing is not about forgetting what broke us. Maybe it's about finding the people who can sit beside us until the broken pieces don't feel so sharp anymore." The next morning, she received another message, this time from a number she didn't recognize. It read, "He talks about you. He says you reminded him he's not alone either." Sandra paused, stunned. She didn't know who sent it. She didn't know if it was someone close to Keanu or just a mistake. But her heart beat faster, because for the first time in a long time, she realized she wasn't just receiving healing, she was giving it too, and that, in itself, was the twist she had never expected. Their journey was no longer just about surviving their own storms. It was about slowly becoming the umbrella for each other when the rain came down. But little did they know, storms would return, harder than before, testing if kindness and resilience were enough to hold them steady. When the past knocks again, the weeks that followed became strangely gentle for Sandra and Keanu. It was not the kind of gentleness that removes pain, but the kind that makes pain easier to carry. Their quiet bookstore walks, their late-night tea moments, and their slow conversations stitched little pieces of healing into both of their hearts. Yet life has a way of testing every fragile progress. Just when healing begins, the past often finds its way back, knocking louder than ever. This is the hook. What happens when two souls trying to mend suddenly face the ghosts they thought they had left behind? Sandra's ghost arrived on a rainy evening. She had just returned from a long shoot and placed her phone on the table. A message blinked. Her hands shook the moment she saw the name. It was someone from her past, someone tied to her heartbreak, a name she thought she had erased. "I'm sorry for everything. Can we meet?" Her breath grew shallow. She closed her eyes and pressed the phone against her chest. She wanted to ignore it. But memories don't let go that easily. The next day, she told Keanu, they were sitting at a quiet diner, sipping soup that neither of them was fully tasting. Sandra whispered, "He wants to meet." Keanu looked at her calmly, then asked, "What do you want?" Her voice broke. "I don't know. Part of me wants to scream. Part of me wants to hide. And part of me just wants answers I never got." Keanu nodded. He didn't rush her. He didn't say she should or shouldn't go. Instead, he said, "Sometimes the questions we carry hurt more than the answers we fear. But remember, you don't have to face him alone." Those words landed deep. For years, Sandra had faced her storms by herself. Now someone was offering to stand beside her. A few days later, she agreed to meet. The cafe where it happened was crowded, noisy, and filled with the smell of roasted beans. She sat with her hands trembling, waiting. Keanu was nearby, not at her table, but in the background, quietly present, giving her strength just by being there. The man walked in. His face carried the weight of regret. His words spilled apologies, but apologies that came too late. Sandra listened, her heart pounding. The conflict inside her grew sharper. Forgiveness or closure? Escape or confrontation? The hook here lies in her silence. She didn't explode. She didn't smile. She just looked at him and said, "You broke something that took years for me to build again. I don't need your sorry to live. But I needed to see your face and know that I can walk away without carrying your shadow anymore." She stood. The man tried to follow, but then he noticed Keanu rising in the corner. Keanu didn't speak. His calm presence alone made the man stop. Sometimes strength doesn't shout. It simply stands. Sandra walked out into the rain. Her breath shook, but her steps were steady. Keanu handed her an umbrella. She whispered, "I didn't forgive him, but I feel lighter." Keanu replied softly, "Sometimes forgiveness is not about the other person. Sometimes it's about freeing yourself from carrying them any longer." They walked together under one umbrella. Raindrops blurred the city lights, making everything look softer, like the world itself was telling her, "You're allowed to heal now." But here comes the twist. The storm was not only hers. Keanu's past was waiting too, darker, heavier, and closer than he expected. A week later, while Sandra was preparing for a film shoot, Keanu received a letter in the mail. Not typed, handwritten. The paper carried a name he had avoided for years. It was from someone tied to his deepest grief, someone connected to the tragedy that had shaped his silence and his kindness. He sat in his apartment, the letter unopened, staring at it as though it were a ghost rising from the ground. He didn't tell Sandra at first. He didn't want to burden her after what she had just faced. But Sandra noticed. She noticed the way his hands lingered longer on his pockets, the way his eyes seemed more distant, the way his smile faded faster. One evening, she confronted him. "You're carrying something," she said gently. "Don't hide it. Not from me." Keanu hesitated, then placed the letter in front of her. Sandra read the name, her eyes widening. "Are you going to open it?" she asked. Keanu whispered, "I don't know if I have the strength." Sandra leaned closer. "Then let me sit with you while you do." This was the real turning point. The story had shifted. It was no longer Sandra being the one healing while Keanu stood beside her. Now it was her turn to hold him through his storm. And as Keanu's fingers slowly tore the envelope open, both of them knew that what was written inside could either break the fragile peace they had found, or teach them that healing is not a one-time act but a shared journey of resilience and kindness. The suspense tightened. The letter was open. The past had finally arrived. The letter that shook the silence. The room was still. Keanu sat with the letter in his hand, the paper trembling like it carried thunder inside. Sandra sat close, her hand resting gently on the table, not touching him, but letting him know she was there. The sound of the envelope tearing felt louder than the rain outside, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. This is the hook. What happens when a man who has spent his life hiding his pain finally faces the words he avoided for years? What happens when silence has to meet truth? The letter began with 3 simple words. "I forgive you." Keanu froze. Sandra tilted her head, confused. He whispered, "Why would she write this?" "I was never the one who needed forgiveness." His voice cracked, heavy with years of unsaid grief. The letter was from the brother of a woman Keanu once loved deeply, a woman he lost in a tragedy that carved scars into his soul. The brother's words spilled out in uneven handwriting. "For years, I blamed you. I thought you should have saved her, should have done more. I carried that anger against you, against myself, against the world. But anger is poison, and it almost destroyed me. Today, I write to let you know that I no longer blame you. I hope you don't blame yourself either." Keanu's chest tightened. His hand gripped the paper so hard it almost tore. His lips trembled, and for the first time in a long time, tears filled his eyes. Sandra placed her hand over his, steadying it. She whispered, "This is what you needed, isn't it? Not because you were guilty, but because you needed someone to release you from the cage of guilt you built yourself." Keanu shook his head slowly. "I spent years carrying her memory like a weight. I thought if I held it tightly enough, it would keep her alive. But all it did was keep me trapped. And here lies the emotional twist. Sometimes the chains we carry are not locked by others, but by ourselves." They sat together for hours, not speaking much, letting silence be the language of healing. Sandra realized that the strength Keanu always showed the world was not the absence of pain. It was the discipline of carrying it without letting it crush others. The next day, Sandra asked him to walk with her. She took him not to a studio, not to a cafe, but to a quiet community center she supported secretly. Children ran through the halls, laughter echoing against the walls. Many of them came from broken homes, some from loss, others from stories too heavy for their age. Sandra knelt beside a little girl drawing on the floor. "She lost her father last year," Sandra explained softly to Keanu. "She doesn't speak much, but she draws her feelings." The girl showed them a picture, a figure standing alone under the rain. Keanu's chest ached. He saw himself in that sketch. He crouched down and asked gently, "May I draw with you?" The girl nodded. He took a crayon and added another figure to the picture, standing beside the lonely one, holding an umbrella. The girl looked at him, then smiled faintly for the first time in weeks, hook after hook. The story kept unfolding. Healing was no longer just about the letter. It was about what they did with the freedom it gave them. That night, Sandra confessed something. "When I faced my past in that cafe, I thought I was done with it. But seeing you with that girl today, I realized our healing is not complete until we help someone else heal too." Keanu nodded, his eyes reflecting quiet determination. Maybe that's what we've been given this pain for. Not to keep it, but to transform it into kindness for others. And yet, as hope began to grow stronger, life delivered another twist. A news headline broke the next morning. Paparazzi had spotted Sandra and Keanu together at the community center. Whispers filled tabloids. Secret relationship? Hidden story? Unexpected pair? The kindness they shared privately was suddenly being painted as something scandalous by the outside world. The conflict deepened. Sandra received calls from her management, warning her to be careful about her image. Keanu received reporters waiting outside his apartment, asking if he and Sandra were more than friends. But here is the heart of the suspense. Would they allow outside noise to shatter the quiet bond they had built? Would they let the world's shallow headlines damage the fragile healing they had fought for? Sandra looked at Keanu, her voice steady. We can't let them twist this. What we share is not about rumors. It's about truth. Keanu held her gaze and replied, Then let's live in truth. No explanations, no defenses, just kindness, no matter what they say. Their decision was made. They would walk forward, not with fear, but with the same humility and resilience that had carried them through storms before. But little did they know, one more test waited ahead, one that would not come from the past or the press, but from within their own hearts. The storm within, the days after the news broke, were filled with noise. Tabloids screamed with headlines, talk shows debated their every move, and strangers on social media decided what their story meant without knowing the truth. Sandra felt the weight of it press on her chest. Every time she opened her phone, there were pictures of her and Keanu at the community center. The world turned a moment of kindness into gossip. Here is the hook. What happens when healing between two souls is tested not by their past, but by the eyes of the world that refuses to let them be human? Sandra's manager called her one morning, voice sharp. You need to distance yourself. You can't let this distract from your career. You know how Hollywood works. Once the public builds a narrative, it sticks. Sandra hung up feeling torn. For years, she had lived carefully, protecting her privacy, protecting her children, protecting her heart. And now, all she had done was sit beside a friend, and the world twisted it into something else. Keanu, meanwhile, faced his own share of storms. Reporters waited outside his building, shouting questions. Is this love? Are you hiding something? But Keanu didn't respond. He walked past quietly, his calm face refusing to fuel their hunger. Yet inside, the silence felt heavier. One evening, Sandra finally broke. They were sitting on her porch, the sunset painting the sky orange. Yet her voice shook with exhaustion. I can't do this, Keanu. I can't keep living under a microscope. I don't want my children dragged into this. I don't want to be defined by rumors. Keanu listened. His eyes softened, but his words came slow. So what do you want to do? Do you want to step back from me? Her silence was the sharpest answer. This is the unique hook. Sometimes the real conflict is not between two people, but between the world outside and the trust inside. Keanu stood, walked a few steps away, then turned back. Sandra, we both know we didn't choose this noise, but we did choose to walk beside each other. Are you telling me you regret that? Tears filled her eyes. I don't regret you. I regret the cost of letting the world see us. Those words cut deep. Keanu nodded slowly, his face unreadable. Then maybe the question is not whether the world sees us, but whether we believe in what we are doing enough to stand still while they watch. The silence after that was heavier than any storm. For days, they barely spoke. Sandra threw herself into work, hiding behind long hours and bright lights. Keanu retreated into his quiet routines, taking long motorcycle rides through the city at night, letting the wind swallow the weight he couldn't put into words. Yet, despite the distance, they kept thinking of each other. Sandra remembered the umbrella in the rain, the bookstore drawings, the letter in his trembling hands. Keanu remembered her standing in that cafe, finally free from the man who had hurt her. Their hearts were not angry with each other. They were angry with the world that refused to let kindness remain simple. Then came the twist that neither expected. One night, Sandra's phone buzzed. It was a message from the same community center they had visited together. One of the children refuses to eat. She keeps asking for the man who drew with her. Could you ask Mr. Reeves to come again? Sandra stared at the message, her chest tightening. It wasn't about her. It wasn't about gossip. It was about a child who saw healing in Keanu's quiet kindness. The next morning, she called him. Her voice was softer this time. Keanu, they need you. She needs you. He didn't hesitate. Then let's go. When they arrived, the little girl's face lit up. She ran to him, clutching her sketchbook. This time, her drawing showed not one but two figures standing under the umbrella. The lonely figure was gone. Sandra watched the scene, her throat tightening with emotion. In that moment, she understood something. The world could twist, the media could speculate, but the truth of kindness could not be erased. She turned to Keanu, her eyes shining. Maybe we've been looking at this wrong. Maybe our healing was never meant to stay private. Maybe the world needs to see it, not for gossip, but as proof that kindness and resilience can survive storms. Keanu looked at her, his face calm but his voice steady. Then let's not hide anymore. Not because we owe explanations, but because we owe the truth to ourselves. The decision was made. They would walk into the storm together, not as perfect figures, not as untouchable stars, but as two people choosing respect, humility, and kindness over fear. But as the story of their bond began to spread further, another twist waited, an invitation that would place them in front of the world, on a stage they could not avoid, forcing them to reveal what had been hidden in silence for so long. The stage of truth. The invitation came quietly, slipped into their lives when they least expected it. It was for a global humanitarian event, a gathering of leaders, artists, and activists. The theme was resilience and kindness in times of struggle. Sandra was asked to speak about her charity work. Keanu was invited for his quiet support of children's hospitals. At first, they thought about refusing. Too many eyes, too many cameras, too much noise. But then they remembered the girl with the sketchbook, the way she smiled when she no longer felt alone. They remembered the boy in the cafe saying, "Even heroes need to cry sometimes." They remembered that their healing had already touched lives quietly. This is the hook. What happens when two people who only wanted silence are pushed into the light, not for fame, but to show the world that kindness is still possible? The night of the event arrived. The hall was filled with people in fine clothes, cameras flashing, whispers running like electricity. Sandra stood backstage, her heart racing. Keanu stood beside her, calm as always, but she saw the weight in his eyes. "We don't have to prove anything," he said softly. "We just have to tell the truth." When Sandra walked onto the stage, the hall fell silent. She began speaking about her foundation, about children who needed shelter, about mothers who carried pain without being seen. Her voice shook at first, but then grew steady. "Healing," she said, "is not about pretending everything is fine. It's about admitting we are broken and letting others walk beside us while we find our way again." Then she paused. She turned her head. Keanu stepped onto the stage, unexpected, unplanned. The crowd gasped. Cameras clicked furiously. Keanu looked out at the audience. His voice was low, but it carried weight. "For years, I thought silence was strength. I thought if I carried my pain alone, I was protecting others. But I learned that silence can be a cage. Real strength is allowing someone to sit with you in that silence and share it." The hall grew still. People leaned forward. The air was heavy, but not with gossip, with respect. Sandra reached for his hand, not as a performance, but as truth. "We didn't come here to announce anything," she said. "We came here to remind you that resilience is not built by hiding. It's built by kindness, by respect, by humility, by walking through storms together." For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly applause began. Not the usual applause of entertainment, but the kind that rises from hearts deeply moved. People stood clapping with quiet tears in their eyes. The twist came not from their words, but from the crowd itself. One by one, people began sharing stories of losses, of griefs, of healing. The hall turned into something else, not a stage, but a space of humanity. Leaders who rarely showed emotion wiped their eyes. Ordinary people felt seen, and in that moment, the rumors, the tabloids, the gossip, all of it melted into the background. What remained was the truth of two souls who had chosen kindness over fear. When they stepped off the stage, Sandra whispered, "Do you realize what just happened?" Keanu smiled faintly. "We didn't just heal ourselves. We gave permission for others to heal too." That night, as they walked out of the hall, there were still cameras, still flashes, still noise. But for the first time, none of it mattered, because their journey was no longer a secret. It was a story of resilience, humility, respect, and the quiet power of kindness. And sometimes, the most powerful ending is not a perfect resolution, but the beginning of a movement, one where even the strongest admit they need someone to walk beside them, and where kindness becomes the loudest voice in the room.